Okay, it's 6 o'clock. We're going to start the tour. I'm Jan Da Silva. I'm a board member of the Bedford Preservation Society. And today we're going to walk down 7th Street and look at some houses on Abolition Row. So we're starting here at the Friends Meeting House. And this Friends Meeting House was built in 1822. It's actually the second Friends Meeting House. If you look at the doors, you can see that there was a women's entrance and a men's entrance. We're not going inside, even though they're open. They did offer us to go inside, but we don't have time to do that. And one of the interesting things about the Friends Meeting House is the fact that they have a drop-down wall to divide by sex. So when they had a men's meeting, they could easily separate the men from the women and have the two sides. It's a really interesting building, and hopefully at some point they'll be able to open it up and give more tours of it so people can see it. Across the street to your left, the yellow house is the old Friends Meeting House. That was moved there in 1820, 1822. It was on this site, so it was just moved across the street. And this is the first of several moved buildings that we're going to talk about. New Bedford has a history of moving buildings all around the city. Most people don't realize it. There's some in the historic district. I work for the National Park. There's some in the historic district, like anybody familiar with the Mariners home on Johnny Cake Hill? Well, that wasn't there. It was not built there. It was built on the corner of William and North Water Street, and was moved to that site in 1850, 1851 after William Roach Jr. died. His daughter, Sarah Roach Arnold, moved it there in the 1850s. So on this site is Abolition Row Park. It's a new city park that the ribbon cutting was this past June, 2023. It's the site of two homes owned by John R. Thornton, which was on this site, and Elisha Thornton Jr., which was on that site. Elisha was a known abolitionist. He sheltered William Winters, who was formerly Daniel Fisher, formerly enslaved man who came to New Bedford. He lived with Elisha Thornton 1855 and 1856 before he moved on. He did come back to New Bedford, but that's a known fugitive that lived in a house over here. There's several known fugitives who lived in this area. Elisha Thornton was a Quaker, probably attended this meeting house, and his father was a Quaker preacher. I do entertain questions. I'm not sure how many I'm going to entertain because this is a really large group. So I'm just going to keep talking. And now I'm going to turn, well, you can see that in the corner there, we have a new statue for Frederick Douglass. And I'm assuming this is a New Bedford audience, so I don't have to ask this question about how many people know Frederick Douglass got his name in New Bedford. Okay, good. Everybody got the right answer. So, as I mentioned, this is the old Friends Meeting House on the right. On the left is the Johnson House. Nathan and Polly Johnson were African-American entrepreneurs and abolitionists. They actually owned 7 parcels in this area. They owned a small store on the site of 23 7th Street, and they also owned 96 Spring Street. Where do you go with this? This property doesn't look anything like the way it did when Frederick Douglass came here in 1838. And I always like to tell people that because, I'm into placemaking and talking about what really happened. And that back building that you can see where the air conditioner sticks out, you see that building there? Yeah. Okay, so imagine in 1838, that building, even though it's turned this way, it was the front like this. That's the building that Frederick Douglass came to, that back building. In the 1850s, Polly decided she wanted to make a bigger house like everybody does. They want to move up in the world. They have some money. And she actually took out some mortgages and she decided to have the house pushed back. And she put on this new fancy Italian Greek Revival house on the front. It's the same size, same dimensions as the house in the back. They just moved it back and turned it around and put the front on it. So as I mentioned, Polly decided to take out some mortgages and she put this new fancy front on it. At this point, Nathan was living in California. He decided to go to California for the 1849 gold rush. Quite a few men of color went to California in the 1840s and 50s, and many of them never returned. Nathan is one of the few who did return, but he returned in 1873 after Polly died. It was in her will that Nathan could live in the house after her death. And so I don't know how he got the news, but he got the news between 1871 and 1873, and he was back in New Bedford in 1873, and he lived there until 1881, and he lived in the basement, and I always call that Nathan's doghouse. In this house, they had several formerly enslaved people come there. So first, he wasn't the first, but he was definitely not the least, with Frederick Douglass. He and Anna came here in 1838. Frederick was enslaved in Baltimore. He posed as a seaman, and they took a train to New York and then a ferry to Newport, and then from Newport they came to New Bedford. They were assisted by Joseph Ricketson, who actually had a house down there right at the head of Union and 7th Street. Is no longer existing, 179 Union Street. So that's the problem with New Bedford. We lose houses a lot of the time, so we don't actually have a good indicator of what's left. But we don't know how long they stayed here. We know how long they stayed in New Bedford, more or less, like 3 to 4 years. Their first 2 children were born here. But we don't know how long they stayed with the Johnsons. We know they had 2 other homes here in New Bedford, and both of them are not existent anymore. This is the only place where they stayed that still exists. So another family that lived with the Johnsons was the Gibson family. So that was Betsy, Helen, and Jane Gibson and Catherine Molyneux, who were sent up to New Bedford by Patrick Gibson, who was their enslaver. They were from Georgia. And Betsy was the mother of Patrick's 2 daughters, Helen and Jane. He was the father. He was the father of Betsy's 2 daughters, Helen and Jane. He may have been the father of Catherine, but he wanted them to come to New Bedford so they could get an education. He said he was going to free them, but there's no evidence that he did. And there were a lot of incidents here in New Bedford at the time where in 1838, he had died at that point without freeing them. And the executor of this estate, Edward Molyneux, wanted them returned to Georgia. And he said he was going to send them to Jamaica so they could be free, because at that point, Jamaica was the African enslaved people in Jamaica were freed in 1834. So at that point, they would have been free, but there was no guarantee that that's what he was really going to do. And Nathan refused to send them back. I mean, they actually went to Newport at one point, getting ready to go on the ship to go down, and Nathan decided to not let them go because he did not have a good feeling about that. And so we don't really know what would have happened to them, but I have a feeling they would have been enslaved again and sold even further down south than they were in Georgia, because that's what tended to happen. Nathan got into a lot of trouble for this because the PR around this event was very anti-Nathan. There were a lot of New Bedford white abolitionists who were like, Nathan, why don't you send them back? I don't understand it. Don't you believe this guy? He's telling the truth. And Nathan was like, hey, not really. I don't really believe him. But Nathan had been written up in many newspapers saying, why didn't you send them back? His business probably got a hit for it. But, it's a good thing that he never did that. So another family that lived in the Johnson house, and I will preface this to say, we don't know what house they lived in. We don't know which of the 3 houses that they owned they lived in. I say the Johnson house, but it could have been the Meeting House. It could have been 96 Spring Street. It could have been 21 7th Street. I don't know. I can tell you that, I've been in 21 7th Street. It's very small. It only has like 2 rooms on each floor. And it didn't have a bathroom. They actually put bathrooms in when they put an addition in the 20th century. So it's not very big. But the William Wells Brown, who was another African-American abolitionist, formerly enslaved speaker on the abolitionist tour, sent his 2 daughters to live here in 1848, and they stayed with the Johnson family. And then there were other members. Has anybody heard of the Overseer of the Poor records here in New Bedford? You don't count. The Overseer of the Poor records were a listing of records from 1847, which is when the city was incorporated. I'm not sure when they stopped taking the records, but I'm assuming maybe by 1900, where If you needed supplies provided by the city, you would go to them and they would actually write what you took. So you might get a 1/4 ton of coal, or you might get some food, or you might get some clothing, or you might get, they would take your history as they gave you things. So we know that a woman named Caroline Harris lived in the back of the Johnson house, and she required a 1/4 ton of coal in 1848. That was one way of them finding out how many fugitives actually lived in New Bedford, because they would ask them, where did you come from? Where do you live now? What do you do? What do you need? And those records actually tell you, Jane Doe came from the South, just came last summer, need a 1/4 ton of coal. So it kind of gives you an idea of who was here. And I guess I'll start by saying, one thing in New Bedford, we know that between the 1840s and 1850s, there were 300 to 700 formerly enslaved people here in New Bedford, which may not sound like a lot, but it was a good percentage of the population. In 1850, it was 1,008. And Boston had maybe about 1,500 at the same time. So it was one of the most populated communities with people of color at that time. Yes?
Why did they come here?
They came here because a lot of them would come here because they could go whaling if it was men. If you go whaling and you're gone for 2 years, it's a good way to escape. Nobody knows who you are. They could send you a letter, but they may not know who you are or where you are. People felt that there was a level of personal freedom here because there were Quakers here. I tend to question that sometimes, and I'll tell you why in a second. And there were always jobs here because it was a whaling industry. There was plenty of stuff to do. That's why Frederick Douglass got sent here, because he was a caulker, even though he was never allowed to caulk on any ship in New Bedford, because the white caulkers would not let him. The Union would not let him caulk on the ship. And it had a deep harbor, so there were always ships coming in and out. So the Quaker issue. In New Bedford, we had Old Light and New Light Quakers. So Old Light Quakers are pretty much, I've been reading about this, and it's really hard to translate into English. There's several types of Quakers. The New Lights are people who started following a person who decided to change the way they see the light. The light is inside of you in the 1815. So they became kind of more modern Quakers, but they kind of threw themselves back to the old way of Quakerism. And then you had the Old Lights, who were people who were Quakers from, late 1600s until like 1800. So New Bedford had a lot of people who became New Light Quakers. And that was the Roaches, the Arnolds, some of those people. Those people are the ones who joined the Unitarian Church in the 1830s. So in New Bedford, you have a combination of people who are abolitionists. You have people who are Unitarians who are abolitionists. You have people who are Quakers who are abolitionists. And I just say that because we always tend to lump everybody into the Quaker pool. And I think we should say, no, there were several pools of people. Okay, I just wanted to point out a few houses over here on 7th Street. One is 25, which is a federal building. One of the additions that you see is what's above the front door. That wouldn't have been there at the time it was built. It would have been a plain front. And so that's how you can see some things have changed. I always heard that building was moved to that site. I don't have any evidence of it, but it does look like a federal building in terms of, like, it has the twin chimneys on either side. The fireplaces would be on the outside wall. This house has a lot of additions on it. And I'm sure if we went back there, we could kind of see where the granite foundation changes as you go further back. So that's something that you would notice. And I wanted to talk about this building, which is a stick style building. Stick style building. It's because it's, you see it's decorated with sticks, and it has a very steep slope roof. And that's a building that would have been in the later part of the 19th century. We don't really have many of those in New Bedford, which is why I like to point that out. We have very few of them. It's something that's rare for us, and most people who are into architecture, we always talk about it because we don't have that many of them. So, and then the building over there on the corner, 29, is probably one of the older buildings we have in this district. Again, it's like a federal period building. It has 4 chimneys. So it was a larger building. It has a hipped roof. The front it looks pretty much like the way it was when it was built. So there aren't too many additions except maybe that side door over there. I will talk a little bit about the fact that this is a new local historic district in New Bedford. We have 2 new ones, the Mechanics Lane Local Historic District and now Abolition Row Local Historic District. And if you don't know, a local historic district is one that has design guidelines. The Local Historical Commission, it kind of determines how your building looks and what materials you can use on your building. Not what colors. We don't do colors here in New Bedford. So that's usually okay. You could pick colors. But, the purpose is, I think most people look at government intervention as a negative, and I actually don't. I look at it as an opportunity to save our community, to allow us to have the things that we remember how they looked. I mean, can you imagine? This building was just rehabbed, and we wanted them to put windows in that were that color and weren't vinyl. So imagine, you have these buildings and everybody's putting vinyl siding and vinyl windows in. You kind of lose your historical significance if you just let anything happen. So the need for a local historic district is to make sure that you keep your neighborhoods looking the way they would have during the historic period. We're going to stop here before 35 because this is a building I really like. It's the Samuel W. Rodman Guest House, and he has his main house on County Street. Then there's like a little carriage house behind that, and then there's this guest house behind that. And one of the things I like about it is it still has a slate roof. So, slate is actually a material. We strip it off, but it's supposed to last over 100 years. And it might be something we don't want to do without kind of knowing what kind of condition it's in. So, that's the good thing about it. You can kind of see that. And it's also a Gothic revival house because it was built in 1842. And Gothic revival during that time period, stuff looked a little bit more like churches. We have some. The William J. Roach Cottage on Irving Street is one. To me, that's one of the best Gothic cottages here in the city. And, if you want to see one that's in pretty good shape, that's a good one to go see. We're going to talk about this house here in Walnut and 7th. So this house was George Howland. I don't remember if it's junior or senior, Junior was the mayor of New Bedford in the 1850s. This was started off as a federal house. It was built in 1810. So if we strip off that roof area, if we strip off that front, if we strip off that side, then you're going to see what they actually had in 1810. It's just like you have to strip all of that off, and then you can see how they fancified it later on in the 19th century and added all those things to it. They made it more of a mansion. I guess the good thing about that is it's kind of like we're not going to just move because we want a bigger house. We figure out how to modify and rehab to get a bigger house. So there's lessons to be learned in that. So this was built by Edward Merrill, who was a captain, a whaling ship. He built the little whale oil refinery known as Waypoint today. And he also built the Bourne Counting House. And looking up the street there, that house, the Gilbert Russell House, that's another one of those buildings that was built in 1810. So all that fancy stuff you see on there was not there when they built it. That is, that's what happens when somebody has money, they want to do something later on. Even the Arnold Mansion is like that. When James and Sarah Arnold built it, it would have been much plainer. The mansard roofs and all that came in the 1870s and 1880s. I do want to point out this house here, which is George Howland Jr., his carriage house, because his home was on 6th Street. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because, we talk about Abolition Row. it's not just 7th Street. And that was one of the points I wanted to make clear to everybody. It's the whole it's the neighborhood below County Street. It's County Street. It's just this neighborhood down to Bedford Street, down to Wing Street. There are people who lived in this area who are active abolitionists who assisted fugitives of both color. They were abolitionists of both colors. The African Americans did not actually own the houses. The Johnson house was one of the few that was owned by African Americans. Other people, they lived in the houses as domestics, or they worked in the houses, like the George Howland house we just passed. One of the people who worked for him, John Briggs, he was from Tiverton. He grew up with his sons. He was the father of Martha Briggs. And so there was active abolitionism in this area. So on 6th Street, you still have other people who are active abolitionists. We're just recognizing them on this one particular street. Then this one is the Constant Norton building, and this is another house that has kind of been updated in a way we're not sure. It was built in 1810, I think, so it would have been a much simpler house. And then Amelia Jones owned it later on. I don't know if she's the one who did all the modifications, but making it a gambrel roof and putting on that front and the side and all that stuff, all that's later period stuff that would have happened, that would have occurred on the house. The one Queen Anne house that we have here in this district is this house right here, the Edith Willis house. So that's like a 70, 80, 90 building. There aren't that many Queen Annes in this area. They're mostly older than that, but you can kind of see you can kind of see from the windows up at the top. It doesn't have any turrets or anything. It is a shingle. There's actually a style called shingle style. So it might be that. So there were houses built in the late 1800s that they deliberately had shingles on them. So here we're going to talk about the RJD. So the Roachstone Stuff House was built in 1833-34 by William Roach Jr. He moved up here from the Mariners' home with his second wife, and can I be snarky with you guys? Sure. Okay. His trophy wife, Lydia, who wanted to be up here because everybody else was up here. And one of the interesting things about this particular house is you can see where his Quaker sensibilities are still there, where he can't get rid of them. The house is in wood. It's very plain. It doesn't have a lot of fanciness on it. And the people who came there after him kind of kept it that way. They might have done more with the gardens, but they didn't put any additions on the house. They just kept it looking the same way. Now this carriage house, I think that was built by the Joneses. It wasn't built by William. And both of these families were abolitionists or had abolitionist leanings. Edward Coffin Jones hired David W. Ruggles, who was a known abolitionist in New Bedford. He was named after David Ruggles in New York City. He participated in the colored convention movement in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And he worked here in the house, and there were several other people who worked in the house with the Joneses. And I just say that because even to have people work in your house would have been unusual, because I think at some point later on in the 18th century, they went from having African-American domestics to Irish domestics. So people would have been put out of work once immigration happened. So, yeah. So, I guess we're going to go into the RJD. And of course, I'll be there to answer questions because I feel like I didn't answer any. So if you have questions, come find me. And I guess I just want to end by saying, this is a story of transients, people who come from other places. They find a new home. They're looking for homes. They're looking for people to take care of them. And I'm just saying that because I think we should continue to always think of the United States as that kind of a place. And I know there's some people who don't believe that, but we've always been a place that welcomed other people, and we should continue to do so. And I think I want to just leave you with that.
Yeah, thank you very much.